So one of my all-time favorite comfort foods when it's cold outside in the fall and winter is to come in and have a nice bowl of piping hot, thick Dutch pea soup. So it's also called Ayrton soup, and we used to have this growing up, so this is my version of it. I'm going to try to keep it simple. So I'll get started with the list of ingredients here. 3 carrots, 1 large onion or 2 medium-sized onions, 1 potato, a large package of green split peas, 2 large stalks of celery. And for the pork, we have a pork tenderloin. You can use a boneless pork chop, 1 Rookworst, which is a smoked sausage from Europe, Maggi liquid seasoning, salt and pepper, 2 liters of soup stock, 1 liter of water, a bouillon cube, and 2 or 3 bay leaves. So this is the type of sausage that I use. It's made in Canada, but it is based on a European recipe. So pork and beef as the ingredients basically. So try to get a naturally smoked sausage so it gives you a bit more flavor. So the night before you want to soak your peas with water at least 1 inch above the top level, and there you can see it really absorbs the water. So about 90% of the water goes right into the peas, and it does help reduce the amount of cooking time. So yeah, try to do it the night before, or minimum 3 to 6 hours before you plan to make the soup. So here you can see there isn't much water left that's loose in the bottom of the bowl. But before you cook them, you want to put them into a colander or a strainer and give them a good rinsing. Just like any dried product from grocery stores, you want to give it a good wash. So for the meat, I've used pork chop before, or a pork tenderloin, or even ham hock. So they all work well. The main meat ingredient that really gives it a lot of flavor though is the Rookworst or smoked sausage. So try to source out a decent one, because it really does make a big difference in the flavor. So give your peas a good rinse. I'm using a 10-quart pot here. You want to have a large pot if you're using the large package of split peas, which was the 900 grams. You can buy the smaller package, 300 grams, but just scale down the rest of your ingredients as well then. But give yourself a pretty large pot to work with, because you're going to be adding quite a bit of ingredients and you don't want any boilovers. In total, it takes about 3 hours pretty much on the stove. You initially bring it up to a boil and then you back it off, and you have a medium to low heat simmer for the rest of the time. Okay, so we'll get that on the stove and we'll add our piece of pork tenderloin. We'll add our 2 liters of, this is homemade stock, but you can certainly use 2 liters from the store. And another liter of filtered tap water, or you can use spring water. And you just want to give that a quick stir to combine. So the first half hour you're going to try to bring it up to a boil and give it a couple of good stirs in the meantime. I find a slotted spoon works well for stirring. I'm adding, I think, 4 small pieces of bay leaf. This is optional. Not everyone adds that to their soup, but I do. And you'll see some initial foaming start happening, but usually after about 10 to 15 minutes is when you see quite a bit of foaming, and that's just all the proteins coming up to the surface. So I'll show you that in a second. And I just take a ladle that's like a strainer and just take some of that foam off. It's not mandatory, but you're able to see what's going on underneath it a little bit easier. So I always scoop that off, and you only really have to do that once or twice. After the first half hour, it doesn't foam up as much. Okay, so stir every, I would say, no later than 10 minutes. You want to stir quite often. So here's the 2 large celery stalks, and I'm just cutting them down the center. You can see I have a bit of a wonky board cutting board. I don't think it's flat anymore, so it tends to rock around a bit on me, so makes it a bit of a challenge, but I didn't lose any fingers, so that's a good thing. So for your carrot and onion and celery and your potato, you want everything to roughly be the same size. You're just kind of dicing them in medium-sized dice. They're all going to soften up really nicely after 3 hours of cooking anyway, but you don't want any overly big pieces in your soup either. So I just toss everything in the same bowl because that's all going in a little later on. Some people will also add celery or celery root. It does add a nice flavor. But I wanted to keep this recipe pretty simple with common ingredients that are in most households, so you don't have to make any special trips to the grocery store. But celery is a nice ingredient as well. And if you did have that, it would be the same dicing method. So you can use any type of onion you want. I just happen to have a sweet Vidalia onion, so pretty mild flavor. But you can certainly use cooking onions, yellow onions, Spanish. Doesn't really matter. But in this case, I'm using a sweet Vidalia. So you'll see later on I use a vegetable bouillon cube. You can use beef or chicken. It doesn't really matter. I wanted to keep it fairly neutral, so I just used a vegetable flavored bouillon cube. So the potato you want to use is generally just a regular white potato that's kind of waxy. If you use like a russet or a kind of a flaky potato, it generally won't do as well in soup, so you try to have one with more of a waxy flesh. Again, just cut them in bite-sized diced pieces. And I don't overdo it with the potato. I don't like too many potatoes in my in any soup really, but so I just add one medium-sized potato. But it is a nice addition. Alright, so we're going to set that bowl off to the side for later. So this is after half an hour. We've lost all the foam, and you can see the peas are starting to soften up, so it's still early on, but just you want to give it a good stir every 10 to 15 minutes. Later on in the cooking process, when you're into the 2.5 or 2 hour mark, you really want to pay attention to stirring, because if it gets thicker and thicker, there's a chance that it could be burning on the bottom of the pot. So you just got to be aware of that and keep stirring and checking. But your heat's probably on like a number 3 right now, 3 or 4. So just a simmer. So it's kind of a low and slow cooking. So this is after 1.5 hours. The tenderloin is finished cooking, so we're going to cut it up. Just put some of the peas back in the pot there. So either a boneless pork chop or tenderloin or a ham hock or whatever, but this is around the time that you want it. Once it's cooked, you take it out, you finally cut it up, and then it goes back into the pot. And you should see that it's fully cooked and it's nice and tender and just kind of falls apart. You want to stay away from any meats that are too salty, like if you're using straight ham. That's like a Black Forest ham. You have to be careful that there's a fairly high salt content. So this meat is pretty neutral, but you don't want overly salted meat. And then I generally pull out some of the bay leaves later on into the cooking process. You can either take them out now or later. But it's just I feel they're done their job, so they come out. So here you just break up the bouillon cube and you add it and give it a good stir. So you can see the consistency is starting to get a little more fluid and not as chunky, but it's still pretty thin. So once I put the bouillon cube in, I add all my other ingredients into the soup. So I'm adding my meat back in, my tenderloin. And now I'm going to add my bowl of cut up vegetables. So this is why I don't add too many potatoes. You don't want a lot of starch in the soup because it'll get pretty thick. And some people like it really thick, and they say if you can have a spoon standing straight up in your bowl of soup, then it's just right. But I like it somewhere in between, not too thick, not too thin. So give it a good stir. Adjust your heat to come up a little bit just to get everything cooked, but not too high, obviously. You don't want to burn the bottom. And then you can add your seasonings. I generally add a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper at this stage. You can always add a little bit more at the end. But you don't want to overdo it early on because you're adding your Rookworst, which is your smoked sausage, which does have salt in it already. So if you add too much salt early on, there's no going back. So here I'm adding some Maggi, which is it's kind of similar to soy sauce. A lot of people use it and they're familiar with it, but you can find it in most grocery stores. But there is a high salt content in Maggi too, so just easy on everything until the end, and then do your final additions of that later on. Okay, so here I'm cutting up the Rookworst. This is already fully cooked, so we're not putting any raw meat at this stage in. That's why this goes in later. So roughly 1/4 inch slices. Obviously you don't want a huge piece of sausage with every bite, so just a bite-sized piece. Some people cut each piece in half as well just to make it a little bit smaller, but I think this is generally fine the way it is. Then I just take these corners and cut them into smaller pieces. And we're going to set that off to the side and add it in kind of in the last hour of cooking. So we're almost halfway through the cooking. This is 1 hour and 45 minutes. Give it a good stir. You can see it's getting a little bit thicker. Some people make this in a slow cooker, and they have good results too, so you could always try that out. But you know, if you have the time and you just go back and forth to the stove once in a while, you don't have to babysit it that much. But I like it this method a little bit better than a slow cooker method. The results tend to be a little bit better. So after you've added your Rookworst and you do a taste test, after a little while you can add your a little bit more salt or a little bit more Maggi. I go easy on the pepper because my kids don't like too much pepper, so I know some people add quite a bit more. And you want to bring everything up from the bottom. You can see it's getting quite thick. But that's why it's important to stir, because sometimes things settle down to the bottom and you definitely don't want anything to burn. So keep your heat medium-low. Basically just a good simmering temperature. So we're getting close to the 3-hour mark, and it's almost at the consistency I like it to be. So I'm just doing some final additions of either salt or Maggi just to make it the way I like it, but not too salty for anyone else, obviously. You can always add that later at the table. But I find if you don't add these seasonings throughout the cooking process, it can be quite bland. So this is after 3 hours. You can see everything's fully cooked and it's fairly thick. So we're done. I'm just going to serve up a bowl here. Try not to make a huge mess like I normally do. But yeah, you got to try this out once, at least in the cold season. It is good hearty soup. Again, it freezes well. You can portion it out in the freezer. So there you go. I encourage you to try it out, and thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for upcoming videos. Thanks again. Bye for now.